You're about to hear a show about Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka died about 100 years ago. Well, he died 100 years ago. He's also unbelievably popular right now on social media, especially on TikTok. Franz Kafka is always kind of popular. I think there's something pretty universal about his message about modernity, about alienation, about feeling like you don't fit in, feeling like you don't even understand the rules of a game that is nonetheless very important for you to play. So from everything from Guantanamo to the sitcom The Office, you can see a lot of Franz Kafka running through life today. And we're going to talk about all of that. We're going to start with the TikTok, move out from there, and talk at the end about what would really happen if you woke up one day and you were a bug. Just think about the first time you heard that song, assuming that this is not the first time you heard that song. Most of you heard it a long time ago. And as the song goes along, you know, this is not my beautiful house. This is not my beautiful wife. There's a growing sense of disorientation. There's that sense of feeling unsettled without really knowing the cause of that feeling of being unsettled. But there's also something very funny about it. And that, you could almost say, sums up maybe what we call Kafkaesque, all of those qualities. Franz Kafka died 100 years ago. For that reason, we're interested in him now. But the truth is, he kind of never goes out of fashion. He's got something to say to pretty much every generational cohort, including right now, Generation Z and Millennials. I always feel like he's like the perfect guy for Gen X, but I don't really see a lot of Gen X Kafka things going on right now. But one of the places that Kafka is very hot is on TikTok, where many people stan Franz. And this is according to LitHub. Kafka, this LitHub is quoting from a few people. Kafka is my bare minimum, and I won't date a man until he is Kafka, wrote one young TikToker. Knowing that Kafka died thinking he was a failure, wanting for all of his work to be burned hurts me more than anything, wrote another. We are going to have one of the people who really is making Kafka re-famous, sort of, on TikTok. Maybe the person, the best-known person for doing that. That is Margaret Muka, a content creator, creative executive. Her TikTok handle is AquariusCat444. She has made many TikToks about Franz Kafka, and she's joining us now. Hi, Margaret.
Hi, nice to meet you, everyone.
Well, we're very happy to meet you, too. So maybe talk about how these feelings towards Franz Kafka arose in you. What was the trigger point for that?
Okay, so I first read his book, The Metamorphosis, without thinking that I would really like it because, it has a bug as a cover, so I didn't really think much of it. But when I read it, I just related so much with the main character, Gregor, and it just changed my life after that. Kafka is definitely my favorite author. And the reason I related with Gregor, the main character of The Metamorphosis, is because basically he got transformed into a bug, and his first hardest task was to get out of bed. And I think that so many people my age can relate to that. And I've been there as well. And in general, the main character felt very alienated in society because he wasn't accepted. He wasn't looking in a certain way, or he wasn't living life in a certain way. So, his family abandoned him and he just died. So I think that it's very relevant to a lot of people my age.
It's also, I'm going to come back to this again and again over the course of today's show. It's also funny. And actually, I think one of Gregor's, I haven't read it in a while, but I think one of Gregor's early thoughts after realizing he's been transformed into a huge bug is that he's going to be late for work, which is maybe that is most people's first thought. Yeah. But there is, it's the more you know about Kafka, the harder it is in some ways to understand why he would be funny. But I don't know. I assume that you find him at least somewhat funny too.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny, but then at the same time, like, it has a lot of depth behind it. But I think definitely a lot of people can relate to that. Like, it's very hard having to go to a work that is not fulfilling necessarily. And I think that Kafka talked about these issues a lot. Like, he found his actual real life job very monotonous, and he wanted to just have time to write, but he had to work. And I think so many of us relate to that. We have to just work all day and then commute to work and cook and just live to work. And we don't have that much time to actually pursue what actually makes us happy. So definitely.
So there's another part of Kafka, which is that of the somewhat thwarted romantic man. His love letters are of great interest. There are love letters to different sets of sort of kind of potential fiancés. And I know that's one of the things that you're celebrating a little bit in the TikTok as well. Say a little bit about how Franz Kafka's heart seems to you, the way that he expresses love.
I think that, for example, his letters to Milena, they are the most popular ones. But as you said, he had many other love interests. I think that Kafka views love in a more of an intellectual way and maybe more platonic, because he only saw Milena a couple times in real life. And I think they both had other partners at the time. So it was definitely more of an intellectual, long distance type of relationship. So I don't think he wasn't that traditional in the way he was experiencing love, I guess. But definitely he loved her a lot. He wrote so many letters to her, but I still think that it was more platonic.
We should also say the letters to Felice are also maybe a slightly different kind of relationship, and one where you feel Kafka's almost neurotic need for her all the time. I'd like to point out the rock band The Cure has a song called A Letter to Elise, which is clearly a nod to letters to Felice. So, well, let me ask the other question, because, I mean, terms like heartthrob are starting to pop up, at least in the coverage of the TikTok and Instagram and other social media celebrations of Kafka. I don't know. Is Kafka hot?
I wouldn't really say that myself, but yeah, I do think that it's a big trend. I just think that people feel a bit disconnected. So seeing him write love letters and express love in that way really makes people want that, because we don't really have that in our generation easily. But I wouldn't personally consider him hot in that way. But yeah, it's definitely a trend where people from like the Gen Z generation just find him attractive, maybe because he was a bit just strange as a person. So definitely I can understand why some people find him attractive in some ways, but I wouldn't say that.
He's kind of ambivalent about everything, including his own writing, and that attitude continues up to the point of his death. He specifies to his literary executor, his very good friend, and also kind of a stan as well, Max Brod, that he wants all the remaining stuff burned. And he doesn't really, I mean, a lot of what we think of right now as his oeuvre was in fact published posthumously. Like other writers like Melville, I don't think Kafka was all that well known, not the way he is now at the time. And I know there is something incredibly tragic about that too. This man who now is really kind of regarded as, Auden said that he was to his century what Dante and Shakespeare and Goethe were to their centuries. So here's this towering person who has no idea, I think, Margaret, that he's towering.
Yeah, I think that is the most interesting and the best part about Kafka. It's sad for him, but he just died thinking that he's useless and that he's not talented and that his work is not that influential. And it's really interesting to see that he was actually very ahead of his time, and that everything that he explored with his writings is very relevant to today. He talked about mental health issues. He talked about his weird relationship with his father, and I think these were taboo topics back then and not that appreciated. And I think it's just a great example for people to not be that self-critical and to put themselves out there and be a bit more confident, because also in his love life and in just every aspect of his life, he was very insecure and self-critical. So I definitely think that, yes, he wasn't recognized back then as much as he should have, but I think that it's the perfect timing for this to happen right now. So,
well, Margaret Mucha, thank you so much for spending time with us today and sharing your love for Franz Kafka, your platonic love for Franz Kafka, content creator and creative executive, busy person. Her TikTok handle, once again, is AquariusCat444. You can see some of this Kafka stuff there. Margaret, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
And let's transition over now to our other guest in this segment. Carolina Watroba is postdoctoral research fellow in modern languages at Oxford's All Souls College and the author of Metamorphoses in Search of Franz Kafka. Benjamin Balin, who's been with us before, is author of Kafka's Last Trial, among other books. His new book is Bruno Schulz, An Artist, a Murder, and the Hijacking of History. So I think maybe I'm just going to begin by asking each of you, starting with you, Carolina, just to maybe react to what you heard there, what you heard from Margaret. I know that you've been traveling all over the world, finding all the resonances that Kafka seems to have in all kinds of different societies and locales. But what did you hear in what Margaret said?
Yeah, thank you. So I actually first came across Kafka on TikTok when I was writing the book, because another woman of a similar age got in touch with me to interview me for her student newspaper about how Kafka is trending on TikTok. And, at first I didn't really know what this was about, but then I had a look and I thought it was really interesting. And what's so interesting about it to me is that in some ways, I think it really gets Kafka, but in other ways, it actually, certain ambiguities about Kafka are lost in interesting ways in this wave of fascination on TikTok. So Kafka as a perfect lover, for example, that is quite a paradoxical Kafka that we see there, because the letters are incredibly touching and poignant, but also some parts of the letters that he wrote to his fiancées are actually incredibly, possessive, almost obsessive. And really, those letters were one of the best things about having an affair with Kafka, because otherwise he was very scared of commitment. None of his engagements led to a marriage. He was really afraid of a bourgeois marriage. So it was quite interesting to see him as this cast as this perfect lover. But then in other ways, yeah, I think it does capture something about this enduring fascination and about the sort of phenomenon of this funny man from Prague who still keeps speaking to people 100 years later.
Yes, by the way, the letters to Felice are just kind of weirdly needy, and kind of over instructive about how often she needs to write to him and in what tone. But so Benjamin Balin, say whatever you want about what we've heard so far. Although I think one of the interesting questions to explore is any particular time in modernity particularly Kafkaesque, or has life been kind of Kafkaesque since the Austro-Hungarian Empire at minimum? We just kind of notice it from time to time as the decades unfurl. But go over wherever you want with all this.
Well, thanks, Colin. And I think let me begin by saying that Kafka was not just ambivalent towards commitment, as Carolina quite rightly says, but I think even more largely towards belonging. And that's what makes him, I think, speak to us today. I think his writing was really born of the impossibility of belonging. He sort of pulled away from the temptations and the invitations of belonging, whether that belonging was represented in matrimony, whether that belonging was represented in something collective or national. The famous the famous line that he delivers where he said, what do I have in common with the Jews? I have hardly anything in common with myself.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, and if we could just stay with that ambivalence for a second there too. I think, it's there also just in his attitude towards his own work and towards having his work published. I think at some point he says something like, I am roughly equally as happy to have my work returned to me by a publisher as I am to have the work published by a publisher. The entire time, this entire life, it seems, Benjamin, like he's even struggling with that. Is it good to be a writer? Is it good to be me as a writer? Is it good to have my work published? Is it good to have people see these things that I've written? It's a question that he doesn't ever really seem to quite resolve.
That's absolutely right. And that's why, as you mentioned, it's really Max Brod, his best friend and literary executor, who is responsible for creating the Kafka myth that endures a century after Kafka's death, that endures to this day. Max Brod wasn't just the literary champion who pressed Kafka into sending his works to publisher, but as you mentioned, Kafka left all three of his novels unfinished at his death. It was Max Brod who painstakingly edited them, gave them order, brought them to us, decided not just to betray Kafka's last wish, but to do the very opposite, to publish everything, including not just the fictions, but the love letters, as mentioned, including Kafka's letters to his father, including his diaries, a recent retranslation of which was just issued by Ross Benjamin, which I highly recommend. So, here's this incredible act of betrayal as rescue. In a sense, Max Brod had to rescue Kafka from himself, and that's, I think, when we speak of an author or as someone who speaks to us. I think what we mean in part is that we feel that they understand us even when we don't quite understand ourselves. And that's personally how I feel when I read Kafka's works, as well as Kafka's diaries and letters.
So, Carolina, I may be forcing a resemblance where it doesn't really belong, but, we think about TikTok and it's a very, very short form. And when we think about Kafka, I think most people do think maybe about the three not entirely completed novels and about the Metamorphosis, which we can call it a novella or a long short story or whatever. But an awful lot of Kafka's works are these very enigmatic short things. They're either prose poems or diary entries that seem to be morphing into something more than that, or just, we now have a term, the short story, the incredibly short story. I'll actually read one to you, and then I just want to, it's one that you'll know very well, obviously, but and I think this is a Ross Benjamin translation of it too. It's often referred to as "Wish to Become an Indian." If only one were an Indian, ready right away and on the running horse, aslant in the air, briefly shaking again and again over the shaking ground, until one dropped the spurs, for there were no spurs, until one cast off the reins, for there were no reins, and one could hardly see the land ahead as a smoothly cropped heath, now without the horse's neck and head. That's the whole thing. I don't know what that is, whether it's a story or a prose poem, but it's kind of interesting, Carolina. I mean, he worked a lot in these very, very short forms.
Yes, he was very much the master of the short form, although I'm not sure that he would have described himself as such, because he was often very frustrated about not being able to finish writing. One of the few texts that he was really happy with throughout his life was a story called The Judgment, which he managed to write in one night, starting at 10 p.m. and finishing at 6 a.m. And it was this sort of enthusiastic spurt of creativity. So it's almost as though he can really only write what you can write in one sitting. But what you just read out, which is a fragment that I really love, is even much, much shorter than that. It's really just a few lines. And interestingly, this little fragment itself is about sort of disappearing or realizing that something that you think is there is actually not quite there, or actually fantasizing about something being there, not quite being there. It's so enigmatic and sort of evocative, and clearly the extreme brevity of this fragment about disappearance is part of its charm and closely connected to that absence at the heart of this little text. So Kafka really does excel at writing those, one sentence just a little note. And as you say, it is extremely difficult to even draw any boundaries around those sort of little literary gems, because as you hinted, they often grow out of his diary, of a notebook that he keeps. He will sometimes start writing something and never finish. Sometimes he will try a few times, a few different versions of a little sentence. He is clearly always thinking about those stuff, evocative little fragments or shards. And even if he is quite frustrated at not being quite able to build them up to big novels, I think over time, we collectively really developed quite a taste for this kind of writing.
Yes, I would agree. Yeah, no, I mean, sometimes with the diary entries will start as what appears to be a diary entry, and then halfway through it'll say, and I am so short and so fat, and he was actually tall and had a lot of trouble keeping weight on at all, and you suddenly realize, oh, this isn't a diary entry anymore. He's writing in some other voice. I want to talk about that idea of Kafkaesque, Benjamin, and that's a thing that, it has a lot of different components to it, but as it is embodied by the trial, it is, I think, about people trying to navigate some kind of system that they don't understand. It's like Durkheim's definition of anomie. There are rules that you can't see, that you don't know. They don't make any sense. There's no logic to them. And I do feel as though that never goes away. And even the idea of being held on a charge that is never explained to you never goes away. I mean, as we watched what unfolded in Guantanamo after 9/11, the U.S., this kind of paragon supposedly of freedoms and of rule by law, started holding prisoners without any charges. Maybe say a little bit about that there is almost a kind of permanence to the sense of injustice is the wrong word, but kind of illogical systems that purport to deliver justice.
Right. I think when somebody like you quoted W.H. Auden about how Kafka encapsulates the 20th century, I think it has to do, of course, with the angst, the ambiguities, the bafflement in the face of bureaucratic forces. In that sense, Kafka, in his very deceptively simple style, manages to confer all of that. I think, despite his clairvoyance about this impersonal cruelty of the bureaucratic state and the alienation of contemporary life that he talks about. Really, I mean, the astonishing thing for me is Kafka could never have foreseen how many admirers, including TikTokers, would both read and misread his fictions after his death, and how many people would seek to appropriate him for their own purposes. And there was, of course, the existentialist Kafka that sort of propelled the Kafka craze of the 1960s. There's the psychoanalytic Kafka, people who read Kafka's stories like A Hunger Artist as neurotic heralds of these self-tortured, uncanny poets. And Kafka, of course, was pulled into this or that political cause. And I'll just, relate an anecdote, if I could, about how he was used and why his name was turned into this adjectival cliche that you mentioned, the Kafkaesque. Is that there was this in 1956 when the Soviet tanks were crushing the Hungarian uprising. A Marxist literary critic by the name of Georgi Lukács was arrested in Budapest, and he was sent to this castle in Romania. He was not told the charges against him, much less offered the right to rebut them. And his line at the end of all of this was, "Oh, so Kafka was a realist after all."
Yeah, I mean, we've been mentioning Russell Benjamin here. I heard him tell a story, or make the observation. There's the podcast Serial is done its most recent season about Guantanamo, and there's one episode where this man who's been arrested for kind of not much at all, not anything that really they would be able to make a case about. He's been arrested, held in Guantanamo, but eventually his interrogators go on his honeymoon with him. He gets married, and they go on his honeymoon with him to Lake Tahoe, and they get the government to pay for it. And it's just, he said, that level of absurdity is also part of Kafka. That this horrible, absolutely unjustifiable thing would happen to you for no sensible reason whatsoever. But then maybe something kind of funny would happen after that as well. We're going to take a quick break here. We're going to come back. We want to hear first from Carolina, who's been also looking at how Kafka is understood and enjoyed in places like Korea and other Asian nations, and much more besides, so stay with us. So we're talking about Kafka. I'll explain in a second why I'm playing that song. But with us is Carolina Watroba, a postdoctoral research fellow in modern languages at Oxford's All Souls College and the author of Metamorphosis, In Search of Franz Kafka. Benjamin Balint is author of Kafka's Last Trial, among other books. His new book is Bruno Schulz, An Artist, a Murder, and the Hijacking of History. Before we get to Korea and things like that, since we just played that song, Carolina, Kafka kind of famously was freaked out by telephones, and it's there in the castle. It's there in a short story called My Neighbor. Obviously, a fairly new technology. I clearly didn't like it. But part of the story of Kafka is somebody who is experiencing maybe the kind of early surges of what we think of as modern technology. He is going through that technological revolution. It may touch him in his private life. It definitely touches him in his professional life, where he is working in a pretty high-ranking job eventually at an insurance company. But I mean, maybe just talk a little bit about Kafka and technology, taking us all the way from his fear of the telephone to his presence on TikTok.
Yes, so Kafka had this fearful fascination with new technologies. So yes, they freaked him out, but also he constantly wanted to hear about them. And here his letters to Felice Bauer, one of his fiancées, are very instructive, because she actually, one of the things that clearly were the most attractive about her to him was that she worked in a company in Berlin which produced sort of audio instruments, audio equipment called a parlograph, which was like an early dictaphone. And he was often asking her about, for the details of the new designs. And she ended up being sort of like the marketing executive at her company. And that really fascinated him. And he would come up with these sort of little funny predictions for the future. He was imagining what it would be like if her parlograph from Berlin connected with his telephone in Prague, and how they could have a conversation without the two humans actually having to participate at all. So he, so there you have this sort of classic Kafka humor, but also some sort of anxiety about technology replacing human connection, but also actually clearly some attraction to this possibility that technology could replace humans, since Kafka was often so awkward about in-person interactions, especially with women. So that's something that he experienced in his life, and then it makes its way to his writing. And in particular, his one of his novels, which is the one that probably people have not heard about as much, which is called America, or The Man Who Disappeared, depending on the translation. This is a novel set in the United States, which Kafka had obviously never visited, but he read some contemporary accounts of the United States, and part of what fascinated him about the US was this rise of modern technology. And that novel is absolutely chock full with, automated desks and complicated systems connecting multiple, just dozens of telephones. And the main character is always sort of intrigued by all of these different mechanisms and actually decides he would like to become an engineer, which he can never quite achieve in the novel. So this has led to Kafka being in many ways seen as not just a prophet of totalitarianism, as Benjamin was explaining earlier, but also specifically this technology-fueled dystopian state. That's how he is often talked about today in discussions about AI and ChatGPT and the rise of those modern technologies.
So Benjamin, I think another thing that can kind of get a little bit lost, but I think it's interesting and important. Kafka is alive and working in an office at a time when maybe the office culture, the office experience, which has kind of overspread life globally since then, is maybe in some of its earlier stages. And he's got this pretty important job eventually at this insurance company. He's senior legal secretary of the Workmen's Accident Insurance Institute for the Kingdom of Bohemia in Prague. Hard to say in one breath. And actually, Princeton University Press recently, a few years ago, collected a lot of his work writings about workmen's compensation and workplace safety, and even letters arguing for a salary adjustment in his favor. But you get the feeling that doing this and learning about and having to understand bureaucracy and technology and the safety of spa elevators in Marienbad, or new automobile safety and stuff, it's probably not unimportant, right? I mean, in a way, being in a somewhat alienating office environment also grounded him a lot in the life a lot of people have wound up living.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think, this points to the duality of our own view of Kafka biographical and his works, right? In the sense that on the one hand, Kafka was a person who needed solitude. He once told his friend Max Brod, "What I have to do, I can only do alone." On the other hand, as you mentioned, in his novels and his stories, he is profoundly registering the convulsions of his time, of the 20th century, but also of our entry into this new bureaucratic kind of modern way of living. And there's a deep antinomy there that all biographers of Kafka, and by the way, Max Brod was the first biographer in 1937, have to contend with at some time, is, how do we reconcile the Kafka of the imagination, of the literary imagination, with the biographical, factual Kafka? There's very deep mysteries there, and there's a great struggle to reconcile those two realms that give his literary expression such acuteness and such purity. But it's precisely that paradox that we have to understand when we talk about Kafka's own ambivalence and his wavering sense of self.
All right, so I'm going to play when we decided we were going to do this show, and it's really kind of our second episode about Kafka. The one thing that I insisted on playing is actually a clip from another show. We've done, more than 2,000 episodes. I think this might be my favorite moment in the history of this show. Irene Papoulis, who's a scholar and writer and a regular guest on our show, was on an episode in 2016 about losing and feeling like a loser. And somehow or other, she got on to this particular tangent. This is B2. We're going to play B2 right now, Control Room.
I've heard about that imposter syndrome, but I sort of feel like I've often had the opposite. I hate to say it, but so the feeling of if only people really knew me, they would recognize me, but I can't be recognized in the world for whatever reason. So that's the person who's afraid to speak, but just thinking if I could just speak, then I would have a great life. But I'm just, and so that's why I identify with Gregor Samsa, the Kafka character in Metamorphosis. He wakes up, he's a bug. He has this whole inner life where he's thinking these things. He's listening he listens to someone playing a violin and he just like has this, he's moved. He's like, he has all this like rich inner life, but no one can hear him. He tries to talk and all they hear is gibberish, and they throw slops at him and they think he's disgusting. He tries to come out the door so he can listen better to the music, but they think he's so hideous that he has to cower behind the door. That's the kind of loser I can identify with, but that's really different from the imposter loser.
That was so great, though, what you just said. It is like, that's Irene's Match.com ad. Character I identify the most with, Gregor Samsa in Metamorphosis. So, Carolina, there is a universality to this story, to the story of of Metamorphosis, which in some of the more newer translations is the transformation. There's some debate about what the right word is to use in English. But I'm assuming as you traveled the world, you found that, a lot of different cultures, maybe all cultures, can identify with some version of what Irene was just talking about there.
Yes, definitely. So there is this incredible resonance to this evocative image of a person waking up in the body of an insect, and it really seems that across cultures this is easily intelligible as something very negative. But the sort of details of what this actually evokes for people, the richness of how people have read it, is really quite astounding. So everything from women experiencing motherhood for the first time and feeling like this central image from Kafka describes what has happened to their bodies, to Black people living in a racist society, and again feeling that this image expresses something about their condition, to people living under dictatorships or in sort of states under state control that restricts their movement and their freedom of expression. That really is that richness in the way that this story has resonated for people across time, across language, across culture is really something quite unique. There's not many writers who have managed to create such an enduring and somehow immediately intelligible image. But of course, we feel like we know straight away what this is about. But then actually the story is so much more complex that this can sometimes be, quite an illusory simplicity.
Just very quickly here, because we're a little short on time, but, we currently are talking about things like K-dramas, which refer to dramas, films and television coming over from Korea. But K can mean two different things, right? It turns out Kafka and Korea get along pretty well. Just quickly give us kind of a sense of that, Carolina.
Yeah, so when I was working on my book, I started noticing that a lot of K culture, as it is known now, coming from Korea, so literature, film, and so on, is being sold to readers in the English-speaking world as somehow especially Kafkaesque. And this really interested me, and I wondered if this was just a marketing gimmick or if there was something more to it. And the answer is quite complex, and it has several elements. One of them is that Korea really is one of the places where Kafka is so widely read. Read at school, translated dozens of times. The Castle has been translated into Korean something like 37 times. And really, all self-respecting writers in Korea will have been reading Kafka since their teenage years. But at the same time, Kafka there has also become part of the really state-sponsored publicity machine trying to raise the legitimacy and the prestige of Korean culture internationally. So it's sort of different forces, they're working together to make Kafka so popular in Korea and then to introduce Korean culture to us here as Kafkaesque in nature.
Benjamin Balin, I've only got about a minute or so left here, but just to talk about another international experience. You taught Kafka to Palestinian students in East Jerusalem. Talk about how that resonated.
Well, I taught the famous parable that Kafka writes called Before the Law, where he talks about a supplicant from the countryside seeking admission to the law, who receives this message at the very end of his life that the door before which he has waited in vain, his whole life was intended only for him. And I've always loved reading and teaching this parable, but teaching it in East Jerusalem to Palestinian undergrads was quite an experience, and goes back to your first question of today, which was why and how does this work resonate so widely. But to be very brief, I was reading this parable and we were talking about how this parable was read by the Iranian writer Sadiq Hidayat, and one of my students chimed in. She said, "Why are you talking about Iran? This is about an exclusion that's much closer to home." And she said, just before this guy from the countryside dies, Kafka writes that he sees a radiance which bursts out from behind the door of the law. And my student said, this reminds me of how the word checkpoint got into my life and how not seeing the rest of my country made my eyes lonelier, as she put it. And we talked about, okay, maybe this is how we can maybe recover the key or a key to Kafka's writing and understanding his writing and maybe good literature in general as a kind of radiance that beckons from behind a door that is really intended for each of us readers alone.
All right, that is breathtaking. We'll stop there. You've both been such wonderful guests, Karolina Watroba and Benjamin Balint. We're going to take a little break, reminding you also it's 100 years since the death of Franz Kafka. We're going to come back. We're going to give you a little bit of the science of bugs that you might turn into and maybe what you should do if you wake up one morning and you are just a big old bug. Coming up. Some quick thank yous and credits. Bradley O'Connor is our technical producer today. Watching over everything, ideally, is the Jedi Master himself, Eugene Amatruda. The producer of this episode is the senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show, Lily Tyson. Joining us now is Tim Coulson, professor of zoology at the University of Oxford. His new book is The Science of Why We Exist, a history of the universe from the Big Bang to consciousness. Oxford, of course, is one of the most exalted cradles of learning in the world, a place of great dignity, which is why Tim recently dressed up as a cockroach to read part of Kafka's The Metamorphosis at an Oxford event. Tim, perhaps you should say a little bit more about why it is you took it upon yourself to dress up as a cockroach.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. So to celebrate Kafka's life 100 years after his death at Oxford, we had an Oxford Reads Kafka event. And so 26,000 copies of the Metamorphosis were printed and delivered freely to all of the students, the graduate students and the undergraduate students at Oxford. And each of the 4 bits of the university, the humanities, the social sciences and medicine, were asked to run a few Kafka events around the Metamorphosis, and I was asked if I'd lead the science side of it because I'm a biologist. I'm the head of the biology department and a zoologist. And part of this was we held various events across the university, including discussions about the science of disgust and why insects cause disgust, and a discussion about what sort of insect Kafka was thinking about. And it culminated in a reading of the Metamorphosis in a beautiful theatre in Oxford called the Sheldonian Theatre, and I was reading a bit of it. And I thought, why don't I dress up as a cockroach? Because I knew that the Natural History Museum in Oxford had a cockroach outfit. So I did that, and it seemed to go down quite well.
Well, I'm sure it did. So we should say that just as the word metamorphosis, there is a German word that's very close to metamorphosis. It doesn't appear in the text, which is why some people have started to refer to the work itself as the transformation. Instead, the word cockroach also does not appear in the text. It just kind of, I think, Tim, where our minds default when we think of disgusting insect you wouldn't want to wake up and turn out to have turned into, just cockroaches. We picked cockroach, not Kafka, right?
So the German word that was used in the Metamorphosis was, I'm going to probably pronounce this wrongly, but it was Ungeziefer, which either means insect vermin, or I found one translation which is unclean beast, not suited for sacrifice. But certainly in one of the translations, it's monstrous insect, and another one, cockroach, has been used. And cockroach is interesting because actually cockroaches don't metamorphose. They grow from little cockroaches and then continue to grow to adults. So they don't go through a larval stage like many insects, like moths and butterflies. But obviously the metamorphosis was about Kafka turning into this giant insect. And I think people came to the conclusion it was a beetle or a cockroach because of the description of Gregor Samsa waking up and lying in bed and being on his back and having his 6 legs waving around and struggling to get onto his front. And certainly in English as well, cockroaches, I think a little bit unfairly, to be honest, have a fairly bad reputation and do cause disgust amongst people, particularly when there's large outbreaks of them in unclean kitchens and what have you.
Right. And I think in saying that, I think Freud might identify this as projection. Cockroaches are disgusting because they thrive in environments that we humans have made somewhat disgusting. It's not that the cockroaches are themselves necessarily doing such disgusting things. When they freak us out, I'm thinking maybe they freak us out because they say something about us.
I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, there's over 4,500 species of cockroach, and only a handful of them associate with people. And cockroaches have been around for probably the sort of oldest fossil, and it's a cockroach-like animal. It's not exactly a cockroach. Dates back to about 300 million years ago. And certainly by 100 million years ago, there were cockroaches around. Humans haven't been around, have only been around for sort of about 300,000 years. So cockroaches got on very well without us. And a few species have adapted and have evolved to live off our waste product. But, there are some fantastic cockroaches out there, hissing cockroaches, some with beautiful colors, but the ones that we tend to think about, the ones we tend to see, particularly if we live in cities, tends to be the ones that associate with us and associate with our trash.
You mentioned that whole idea of disgust earlier. And I do think that if Gregor Samsa had woken up as a squirrel, it would have been a very different kind of story. There is something about insects, right? Insects, disgust. We're just not comfortable with it.
So I think that's right. A lot of people don't like insects, and they don't like spiders and things like that. And I think it's to some extent the way that they move, that a fly buzzing around you can be annoying, that the ones that we often see, the ones that sort of, whether they're flies, house flies or mosquitoes or cockroaches, they're either biting us or they're flying around and eating our food, sitting on our food. They'll lay eggs in our food. And I think that's where a lot of the disgust comes from. But part of it is also the way they move, I think. They kind of look alien with their compound dyes often. And, the way that flies feed, for example, where they're sort of, kind of digest the food outside and then suck it in. I think all of that, people just think, oh, that's just not very pleasant, is it? But there are amazing insects, and insects are incredibly important. We think about bees and the role that they play in pollination, and without things like spiders, we'd be knee deep in insects and flies. So I think it's a bit mean to treat all insects the same.
Right. And, obviously when the Anthropocene era ends and we're gone from the earth, they're going to be really relieved. Their lives are going to be way, way easier without us. We've only got about a minute left. And this question doesn't come from me. It comes from Lily Tyson, but it's such a great question. But so the question is, if I were to wake up as an insect, do you have any advice for me? If I woke up as a giant cockroach, what would be a good thing for me to know as I headed out into the world?
Gosh, I think if I was you, I would hope to not wake up as a giant cockroach, and to wake up as a type of insect that people would be more likely to like and not throw apples at and not throw slops at and what have you. I think waking up as a cockroach was, if he had a choice, it was a bad choice of insect to wake up as, if indeed it wasn't a cockroach that he woke up as.
So maybe my best bet would be to disguise myself as a bumblebee or something kind of fuzzy and nice.
I think that's probably right. Something that people would be a little bit kinder towards.
All right, Tim Coulson, professor of zoology at the University of Oxford. His new book is The Science of Why We Exist: A History of the Universe from the Big Bang to Consciousness. That may result in another trip back to this show if we can talk you into it. But let's say goodbye for now anyway. And thanks to all of you. And yeah, read a little Kafka today. It won't hurt you.
Dear, lovely Gregor Sansa, I'll stay near whatever you are. We are two insects, tiny little ponies. I took the plunge to double the fun. And in my opinion, your other friends are phonies. Like your family, they've let you down. Dear, lovely Gregor Sansa, I'll stay near whatever